Everyone, we're just setting the Zoom link up. We'll start in a second. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the panel on the political economy of sexual rights by the Sexual Rights Initiative. A bit of housekeeping. We have interpretation in Spanish, but you'll have to use your own device and log into Zoom for that. And my colleague Pooja can give you a QR code if you want to do that. Please note that none of you is allowed to take photographs. We have a designated member of our team who will take photographs, Margarita, so please don't take any photographs during the session. It's not allowed for security reasons. Before we begin the session itself, we'd like to draw attention to the fact that during this HRC session, civil society organizations are required to pay to use WebEx. And this new requirement places an additional burden on civil society organizations, especially those who might have limited budgets. So we ask all states to fulfill their, and the reason for this is the liquidity crisis. So we ask all states to fulfill their commitments and to call for a GA mandate on hybrid modalities. So my name is Deepika Nath, and I'll moderate today's session. And we're here today to explore a few propositions and the dilemmas that they give rise to. The first proposition is that economic systems are ideological, not ahistorical, neutral, or natural. Therefore, neoliberal capitalism is a historically specific development that emerges from and reflects dominant hierarchies of race, religion, gender, and class that have been shaped over centuries of struggle over power. The second proposition is that sexual rights do not exist independently of economic, social, political, and cultural systems, even as they do take their power from the potential consensus that they are or ought to be universal and indivisible. Thus, gender and sexuality systems in every community, country, and region are deeply entwined with notions of national identity, culture, as well as systems of production and distribution. The third proposition is that because sexual rights are often seen as a direct threat to traditional and naturalized social and economic roles in societies, they can serve as proxies for power struggles over national sovereignty and cultural rights. The dilemmas that emerge from these propositions are: one, despite the profoundly gendered impact of economic systems and crises, the right to development and economic rights, discourses on the right to development and economic rights often ignore gender and sexual rights. Second, most current formulations of rights claims, which divide people into separate categories on the basis of a narrow set of characteristics, fail to acknowledge and respond to the interrelated nature of gender and economic ideologies. Third, under the current international system in which economic systems and policies are isolated from social and rights-based systems, we find that the same countries who promote sexual rights on the one hand may support and benefit from economic policies that make the realization of those very rights impossible in other countries. Thus, rights claims can themselves, ironically, fracture broad social justice movements as we often see in LGBT rights and HR advocacy. Ongoing contestations over the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and other gender non-conforming people and communities in countries in sub-Saharan Africa are an example of the way in which economic measures by northern states and institutions, such as withholding aid or loans, that are enacted to defend the rights of targeted communities can end up furthering the perception that homosexuality is a Western import. Efforts to create solidarity movements across gender and sexuality issues can flounder in the wake of what is seen as a further denigration of national sovereignty and culture. Given these entanglements, it may be useful to think beyond identity-based political strategies and the individualization of rights, including sexual rights, and specifically to understand the ways in which a political economy of sexual rights can offer a more integrated and intersectional approach to addressing rights violations on the grounds of gender and sexuality. This will be the focus of our conversation today. Our speakers today are Jessica Mandanda, who's joining us online. Jessica is an advocacy communications specialist with core expertise in economic justice and rights, with experience in development communications, campaigning and policy analysis for the gendered impact of macroeconomic policy level environment in Africa. She's an alumnus of the Feminist Economics Summer School, African Macroeconomics Academy, Malawi, and a member of the Feminist Macroeconomics Alliance, Malawi, where she provides strategic advice on communications and campaigning for economic justice and rights. Is Jessica online? Okay. Andrea Guillem is a researcher of debt and gender from Ecuador, a member of the International Feminist Economics Association, the Ecuadorian Network of Women in Politics, and communications lead at Women for Global Fund. Andrea is a master's student in feminist studies from the University of Basque Country. Welcome. Our third speaker today would have been Omar Khatib, a Palestinian activist from Ramallah. However, Omar has been detained by Israeli authorities and placed under administrative detention, during which he will not be allowed family visits. He is one of 3,558 Palestinians currently being held in administrative detention by Israel. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, as well as a Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, have called this practice discriminatory and a violation of human rights. We'd like to play a short clip from the first conversation in this series of conversations, of which this is a continuation, which was held in September 2023, in order to represent some of Omar's analysis.
One of these main manifestations of colonialism and capitalism/imperialism is settler colonial entities. But I just want us to use like Israel and the Israeli pinkwashing as just an example. Because it's a big, it can be applied to many cases around the world. And I want to talk about the Israeli pinkwashing through talking about the anti-Israeli pinkwashing activism that I've been part of in the last 8 years. So there is the Israeli claim, the Israeli discourse, which some people call pinkwashing, that Israel says, okay, we are the most queer-friendly state in this region. We have the gay capital, which is Tel Aviv. We are the haven in the middle of a backward, barbaric desert, which is the Middle East. There is this colonial narrative that Israel says all the time, and what we usually do as decolonial activists or in the anti-pinkwashing activism is trying to debunk or to prove the opposite of this narrative, which is what I call, or what I'm recently calling, the liberal trap in the anti-pinkwashing activism. because we're trapped in a loose game, I think, that reinforces and reproduces white supremacy and settler colonialism, and that it gives me it has a sense of let's make settler colonialism better. Like there's like these like tens, if I don't want to say hundreds, but there are like tens of journalistic pieces and reports about the Palestinian who fled to Israel for like from the Palestinian queerphobic violence, and then Israel was so racist and didn't like provide them a haven and like legal papers and safety. So wow, it's not the queer friendly haven in the region. What I said is I don't care. I don't care whether, and we shouldn't care whether Israel was really the queer haven or not in the region or as a state itself. Is that Israel is a settler colonial state that was established and that now exists on erasing and on the erasure and the ethnic cleansing of a whole people and nation. Let's deal with this very foundational concept. I'm just gonna use an example, like a tangible example, which is the city of Jaffa or Jaffa, which used to be the biggest Palestinian city before the Nakba, before the establishment of the state of Israel in the 1948. The city of Jaffa or Jaffa was the biggest like metropolitan Palestinian city with like tens of thousands people and with like like a kind of modernity and like a modern city. But with the establishment of the state of Israel in the 1948, the state of Jaffa, like other tens of villages and cities in Palestine, the people were displaced and it was erased. Like the city itself was demolished to build the huge city, now the gay capital, the world gay capital, Tel Aviv. So this park, Charles Clore Park, hosts big concerts and festivals and events in the what's so-called Tel Aviv Pride Week each year that like hosts tens of thousands of gay tourists mainly who go to the gay capital of the world, Tel Aviv. This park, Charles Clore, there's some kind of like very small hills in this park, which I learned like recently 2 years ago, that these hills are literally the rubble of the city of Jaffa, of the neighborhood of Al-Manshiyah, which used to have like tens of thousands of residents and shops and modern life and cinemas and like our modernity and our like our life that the colonialism de-developed.
Institutions such as the IMF? And can you describe the effects of coercive economic policy?
Shocks significantly since 2015. And with a political shift in 2018 towards IMF-led adjustment programs, Ecuador negotiated a 6.5 billion extended facility fund loan with structural reforms, like public expenditure cuts, with expenditure ceilings, labor deregulation, fuel subsidy elimination, and privatization of public enterprises, as well as financial deregulation. With a colleague, Bhumika Mujala, we conducted a study to focus on how the consequences of austerity impact women's rights. So we focused ourselves during the pandemic period. That was crucial time because that was a time where the state had extraordinary and decisive powers impacted related to saving living measures. So we evaluated how gender austerity affected human rights, sexual and reproductive rights included, of poor women disproportionately through three main channels. So the first channel is through the cuts of public expenditure. Women are the dominated labor force on public sector and the main recipients of public service. In Ecuador, women represent 60% of the labor force in the health sector and up to 85% in key jobs like nursing. These cuts left female-dominated sector understaffed and overworked. From 2018 to 2020, Ecuador health investment decreased by 64%. And during the pandemic in 2020, there was also a total of $227 million that led to layoffs and increased workload for women in healthcare. We conducted several interviews with nurses from the public hospitals who told us they were paid, they were paying with to these cuts with exhaustion, burnt out, and because of the unequal distribution of care, they have to pay other women to take care of their children and pay renting rooms to isolate themselves to protect their families. Another indicator is maternal mortality rate that rose significantly during the pandemic. In 2019, we have 37 maternal mortality rate, 37 above 1,000 women. And we ended up in 2020 with 57.6 maternal mortality rate. This is an indicator that rose 20 points during 2020. While the International Labour Organization stated in the report that Ecuador state budget for health did not reflect the increased needs generated by the COVID-19 emergency, the IMF, in a remarkably opposite sentiment, stated in its second and third review on the loan in September of 2021, they congratulated the government for achieving a lower national deficit in 2020, highlighting savings for lower social security benefits and the reduction of 622 million in pandemic-related expenditure. The total amount of money spent on debt was 2 times the amount of money spent in the health sector. So that's the first channel, the cuts in the public sector. The second channel is the increasing of non-paid care work. Women dedicate 3 times more hours than men on average to this task. And in 2021, UN Women Ecuador released a survey indicating that 7 out of 10 women were time poor in Ecuador, and that 40% of women nationwide that were involved in informal paid work still reported unpaid care work as their primary activity. We also interviewed nurses that they told us that they could only rest 10% of their time because not only they were exhausted working within the hospital, the public hospitals, but they were also the responsibles of the care of their ill family members. And they were also involved in communitarian work, voluntary work. And I want to point it out that the images of the popular pots that we've seen from Argentina to Ecuador, where women are sustaining life through voluntary work in times of crisis. And the last channel is private debt. And I think this is the least studied one. When you erode healthcare system, you force families, particularly women-led families, into crippling debt to access private healthcare. Testimonies that we collect revealed family struggles with overwhelming medical bills, one case totaling $35,000 for a month of care. So this accumulation of consumer debt can be understood as a capillary channel through which the cost of paying foreign debt is transferred to the most vulnerable family, a particular family headed by women. There's a study in Ecuador about the informal credit market, which is a market that is predatory lenders with huge interest rates. And 57% of debtors of this market were low and middle income women. So in such a way, austerity policies are paid for women through their bodies, through their work, by compromising their health in one hand, by being exhausted workers in the public system, by not having access to basic health services such as maternal and gynecological care, by having to extend the time of unpaid work because of they're socially responsible for such care, and by compromising their future work by acquiring private debt in order to survive. So I will leave it there, and then we can continue to another part about the recommendations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think what's coming up really clearly is the fact that the people who are the most affected by economic systems are the ones who are always told that they either cannot understand these systems and certainly have no place in determining them or having a say in what they do. So it's quite remarkable. Who's left out of the conversation? Exactly the very people who should be at the center of the conversation. Thank you very much for that. We'll go to Jessica now. And Jessica, can you explain to us the link between economic injustice and sexual rights in the Pan-African context and the kinds of coercive economic measures that affect access to sexual rights? Can you talk a little bit about the dangers of treating these two spheres separately and how measures to address gender and sexual rights are impeded by the absence of an economic analysis?
Thank you. I hope you can hear me clearly. So thank you so much, and thank you, Andrea, for also just laying the foundation. I think what I have to say builds on what has already been shared. And I think it's interesting how there's so many similarities within the different contexts. So in response to your question, Deepika, I think the intersecting nature of the economic injustices and sexual rights lies within the intersecting nature of the neoliberal agenda and the patriarchal system, in which both economic justice and sexual and reproductive health and rights should potentially be facilitated. And I'll explain this link in sort of a flow, so bear with me. So for starters, we currently have an economic system that is very neoliberal and very colonial in many ways. As it is, the economic system is continuously allowing for the implementation of multiple austerity measures, which is also what Andrea has also touched on, which include the introduction of unnecessary taxes, which is what we see with value-added tax on menstrual hygiene kits, on food, on essential necessities for the education sector, for example. It also includes consistent cuts to the funding to the public sector, especially essential services such as health and education, and then the public sector wage bill cap, among other things. In all its essence, this system is designed to continuously take from the people and to never give back. So what this means is that because public services are not properly funded because of austerity measures, there is a huge gap that is created, and the system becomes too crippled to provide gender-responsive public services, which in turn are supposed to push for the progression on the implementation of human rights obligations, which includes the decriminalization of same-sex relationships, ending child marriage, access to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care, among others. Now, where economic injustice in this regard links to sexual rights and then links to patriarchy is that when the state is then questioned about what is happening in the country in regards to sexual rights, in regards to reproductive rights, and why, for example, in countries like Malawi, the government has not moved to decriminalize same-sex relations, or has not moved to decriminalize access to safe abortion, for example, is that the state will come in to say that the justification is attached to issues of religion and tradition. Now, here is where the most important link is. The link between this justification is that in the history for Malawi, when it comes to religion or mainstream religion, and when it comes to the traditions that we now claim as the justification for violations of human rights obligations, this religion was introduced during colonial times, and the culture that we now claim is a watered down version that was also watered down during colonial times. Now, if we look at who is responsible for the neoliberal economic framework that we also use, that pushes for austerity measures to continuously remove funding from the public sector, the countries or the institutions that are responsible for this economic framework are also the same countries and the same institutions responsible for colonialism. So the flow that I'm trying to make linkages with here is colonialism, neoliberalism, and then we have the patriarchy. And that is where economic injustices and sexual rights intersect. Because we still exist under this very colonial, very oppressive economic system, we do not have the funding or the facilitation or the grounds to properly provide for and ensure access to sexual rights within our context. Now, looking at the impact on SRHR, sexual rights are intersectional in the way that they're excluded from one, state action in regard to the economic accounts to provide and facilitate the grounds for the enjoyment of sexual rights. And two, in that the form a critical element of how we all exist and enjoy our lives with full bodily autonomy and integrity. And a lot of that falls within how the state responds to the need for equality, the need for decriminalization, and the provision of gender-responsive public services to, again, ensure the enjoyment of bodily autonomy and integrity. Now, to sort of wrap up and center everything, and I'll give the example of Malawi because that's where I come from. Malawi, similar to a lot of other countries in the global south, is obligated to fulfill human rights around sexual rights and around reproductive rights, as is stipulated within the country's constitution, which builds on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention on Economic, Culture, and Social Rights, as well as the rights to health and the rights to life. However, because we implement austerity measures under this economic framework, that has been imposed on by the IMF and the World Bank, the government has for a very long time been unable to properly finance public services to ensure the provision of those rights. And they will never admit to say that, oh, we cannot provide funding because we had to reroute the public funds to a different sector because we have an agreement with the IMF, such and such. What they in turn say is, our religion doesn't allow this, our tradition doesn't allow this. But again, like I mentioned, all of this is linked to where we're coming from and linked to our past. If we're going to answer the question around the link between the economic injustices and the sexual rights, we have to look at it that way. And we cannot separate these two issues because everything that happens within the human rights sphere, especially in regards to sexual and reproductive health and rights and in regards to bodily autonomy, is embedded within the macroeconomic framework that we follow. Without the macroeconomic policies that we follow, or if we had more progressive macroeconomic policies, the conversation would be different because there would be provisions and protections embedded within the economy. And I'll close with one statement that Dr. Jessica Bila here in Malawi likes to say in regards to the same issue, is that at the center of all economic oppression, at the center of all structural oppression is the woman's body. And this is a very old statement that she has been saying continuously. And essentially what that means is that if we look at who is impacted the most, and again, similar to what Andrea was saying, at the center of it, we have women, we have the LGBTI community, we have sex workers, we have people with disability at the center of that, who are left with the burden of closing the gap that has been created by austerity, that has been created by regressive tax systems, that has been created by our countries continuously being captured by institutions such as the IMF. So this is all in one issue. And I think this is quite a right time to also have this conversation as we go towards the Global Days of Action for Tax Justice, as CSW is also ongoing at the same time, just to bring everything together and to ensure that these are not separate conversations happening. I'll stop there. Back to you, Deepika.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think the sort of two prongs that I want to quickly pick up on as we sort of segue into the second round is, one, the way in which movements have been divided. Issues have been divided over, I don't know, the last half a century or so, depending on when countries in the global south got their independence, etc. With the entrance of neoliberal capitalism, it wasn't just a way of doing business, right? We know that neoliberalism is also an ideology. It trains you how to think about what is of value, who deserves rights and so on. And so it's so tragic that we live in a world now where issues that emerge from the same sort of control over gendered bodies, over reproduction, right? Both reproduction of labor and, of course, reproduction of life, that these exact same issues that affect a number of gendered, sexualized communities are divided up into silos, and we're just fighting with each other for like meager funding, etc. And I think the second sort of key issue here is that this thing, the economy, which has such a profound impact on how we live our lives on a very day-to-day basis, how women's bodies and lives reflect what's happening in the economy, right? The kind of toothpaste you buy, or are you able to buy one loaf of bread today, or two for the whole week? Like, people face the impact of economic measures in their daily lives on their bodies, and yet we are told that that's something we must leave to the experts, certain people who make these decisions inside closed rooms, and it just seems ridiculous that there's this separation of these two spheres that are so intimately connected. Okay, so we've sort of got a sense of what the problems are. Let's see if we can be a bit hopeful in the second section, and see what kinds of alternatives or other ways of thinking we might be able to generate collectively to respond to some of these issues. Jessica, I'll start with you for this round. And I guess, can you tell us, or talk to us a little bit about some alternatives to the current economic framework in sub-Saharan Africa, and how these might be developed or realized, and how the alternative systems might better address issues of gender and sexual rights. And specifically, could you speak to the role of national governments, the international human rights system, and global economic institutions in realizing some alternatives?
Thank you. So I think the first thing I'll maybe to point out in regards to the role of our governments is a complete overhaul of the current economic system, because it has not worked. It has not worked for countries like Malawi. It has not worked for the African continent. It has not worked for the global south. And we have to do this from an understanding that this system was developed and designed to benefit wealthy countries that are all the way in the north, right? So if you have, and a good example is what happened towards the end of last year in Malawi, where the IMF advised the government of Malawi to devalue the currency by 44%. Now, if anybody has an understanding of what is happening in Malawi and the impact of the multiple crises we've had, any person with any logical sense would be able to tell you that devaluing the currency is going to cripple the people who are, again, giving money to the government in the form of taxes, right? Anybody could have told you that. But we did this because for the many, many years that we have been implementing austerity measures all the way back to the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s when the structure adjustment programs were introduced, we have been letting go of our sovereignty as a state, and we have to overhaul the economic system in order to take that power back and start prioritizing the people, right? So that is the key role of the state. And one of the ways that the state can do this is by taxing the rich and redistributing those taxes to the people. So again, if we're looking at the current tax system within this economic framework, is continuously extracting from the poor, majority of whom are women, in the form of VAT, in the form of paying bypass fees in public service institutions such as hospitals and schools, and not giving anything back. Yet we have multinational corporations not paying taxes to the country at all. And if you're just to check in the news of examples like this, Malawi right now has several cases that are coming out of multinational corporations that are housed within these tax havens and don't pay taxes to the country, right? So if the government was to start taxing the rich and redistributing those taxes to ensure for the provision of public services, bring back the public health system and maintain it, public education and maintain it. And the complete overhaul also has to do with absolutely rejecting and radically rejecting austerity measures, radically rejecting any loan conditionalities that the IMF or the World Bank would then impose on countries such as Malawi. And that is the responsibility of the state. It is not the responsibility of the people. And again, for countries like Malawi, this is actually defined in the country's constitution as the state's responsibility to ensure that people are protected first. And the second thing that the state can also do, and this also ties in with what the people can do in CSOs, is hold the state accountable for essentially failing to implement and to protect human rights obligations. So again, a lot of countries in the Global South are ratified to so many human rights frameworks. That includes the Declaration on Human Rights, the ICESCR, the ICRC. For Malawi, this includes the Maputo Protocol, the SDG.
Okay, I'm not sure if Jessica will come back. I have some of her notes, so maybe I can tell you very briefly some of the kinds of things that Jessica would have said. She wanted to talk about alternative in the form of a feminist well-being economy, which is an approach that aims to repurpose macroeconomic policy towards the realization of human rights and climate justice, and adopts metrics to measure well-being beyond the GDP, which... Ah, wait, brilliant.
Hi, can you see and hear me now? Okay. All right. Is it okay if I just switch off my video so that I don't drop off again? Okay. All right. So I'll just continue on from the second point, which is that we need to start looking at implementing what's already there. So part of our role as CSOs and as the people is to hold governments accountable for what they're not implementing, right? So imagine a world where a country like Malawi starts implementing what they already ratified. And it's not to say, okay, let's sit down and have a conversation about how do we align the Constitution to human rights frameworks internationally. No, it's already there in the Constitution. We're supposed to do this. It is written there. It literally says the government is responsible for ensuring the provision of quality healthcare that is accessible, affordable, and available for all, irregardless of religion, irregardless of sex and gender, irregardless of sexuality, irregardless of gender identity. It is there, right? And this is in alignment to the international human rights framework. So imagine a world where the government actually just implemented this, right? And it's, again, not a difficult thing to do. If they were to tax the rich, redistribute those taxes to ensure that hospitals are properly funded, that would also mean that if hospitals are properly funded, then nurses and doctors are properly trained, and they've gone through a comprehensive education that includes education on sexual rights and reproductive rights. Therefore, we are addressing the issue of discrimination, we're addressing the issue of access, we're addressing the issue of availability, all in one. But this has to come from the government. And part of that is us pushing for that because they're already supposed to do this. And they've already been neglecting to do this because, again, the IMF said, right? So if we take back our power and sovereignty, and if we push our governments and hold them accountable, then we are moving forward. And lastly, in terms of alternative systems, I think one of the most recent ones, and again, Malawi is one of the countries that we did this research on, is to enforce the feminist well-being economy, which essentially does everything we've been talking about today, taking us back to our history and outlining why it is necessary to overhaul the neoliberal economic framework and what it would look like if we do that. Providing for gender-responsive public services, how are we supposed to tax the rich? How are we supposed to redistribute that domestic revenue towards what it's supposed to be used for in the first place? If we do that, and if we take all of these steps and hold the government accountable to ensure all of this is done, then we begin to move. And maybe in the next couple of years, we can have a different conversation about what has been done so far. And if all of this is done properly, then we'll also get to a point where both the government and CSOs understand that we cannot separate the conversation on the macroeconomic policies from the conversation around sexual and reproductive rights, because it is all in one. And we cannot get to a point where we're talking about equality if this is not done first. Yes, I'll stop there. Thank you
so much, Jessica. I'm hoping you'll have a chance to come back towards the end, running against time a little bit. Andrea, what about you? Some alternative ways of thinking about gender and sexual rights, well-being in Ecuador, including indigenous knowledges and worldviews. And again, what are the roles that national governments, international human rights system, economic institutions can play?
Yeah, I think what Jessica just said, and it's perfect to follow the conversation. I will start by proposing a new categories to think sexual and reproductive rights that link the material and symbolic impacts that has the capitalistic, colonial, and patriarchy system. So Andean and decolonial feminists has conceptualized this body territory, which is a concept that was born and conceived on the struggles of women defending their land against extractivism. And it's a category that exposes the material and symbolic impact of exploitation, not only on the livelihoods of communities, but what are the differentiated impacts on a type of sex body that is placed within the gender, class, and race hierarchy. So on the one hand, it breaks with the individualization and the shredding of identities and propose a material and community-based approach, because one cannot dissociate well-being from the body and the territory that one inhabits. Actually, this category has made it possible to connect in the same solidarity and cross-cutted feminist movement bond, the struggles for legal abortion, to the struggles for the preservation of indigenous lands against extractivism, and even the debt cancellation movement. We must understand sexuality and reproduction as a social phenomenon that is rooted in the capitalist and colonial system that defines how certain territories are placed for resource extraction and how certain sexed bodies are placed for labor extraction. Where we are placed in that system, it's linked on how we make decisions regarding our health and our sexuality. Just as feminist economics has argued that is a task performed mostly by women and feminized bodies in the reproductive sphere that sustain the productive sphere and are partly the reason for gender inequalities, the same way sexual and reproductive rights as an instrument for equity and emancipation must highly consider the material and economic implications that people face in devising a just and equitable relationship towards their sexuality and reproduction. So it's not only how we're producing food, how the relationship with nature, how we are organizing livelihoods, but it's also the symbolic production of identities. What are the socially constructed spaces for women and dissidents of the gender system? What they can participate in, they can be represented. All of this is linked with body autonomy and sexual and reproductive rights. So this approach requires for us to take intersectional policies that address the unequal social distribution of care work. And I will just name a few because Jessica already said eloquently and delve about it. So first of all, is strengthen state and community capacities to provide infrastructure for care work, protect and guarantee proper budgets for health, education, and welfare systems. Austerity and adjustment policies are incompatible with sexual and reproductive rights. I will go beyond, and I will resonate with Jessica on this, that the actual capitalistic system that it's placing life itself and its reproduction in jeopardy, it's not compatible with sexual and reproductive rights. We need to take seriously the huge debt crisis that Global South is facing, especially debts with vicious of illegitimacy, and cancel illegitimate debt, allowing fiscal space to states to invest in public capacities for care. Finally, and I don't know if what I'm about to say, it's a bit obvious, but war is not compatible with sexual and reproductive rights or with life. And we need to place our priorities in order and shift these huge amounts of resources from the war machine and saving banks and towards good and public systems of care that ensure the reproduction of life itself. So I will leave it there.
Thank you. We should probably just stop there, but we do have a few minutes. And it'd be great to hear, thoughts from people in the room. But I think just to sort of sum up, I think it's so obvious to those of us who live in and come from poor countries that these struggles are interrelated, right? And then we find ourselves sort of, just sort of donning the gay hat in one forum and then the whatever other hat in another forum. And at the end of the day, it's poor people all over the world who are paying for capitalism. So, I mean, and we know this. So what is this sort of, the naked emperor? Why are we like pretending? So, and I think what's also really clear is that our action has to be collective. It has to be in solidarity with other movements. When none of us is going to win a battle for our rights, I'm not going to win my whatever rights by myself. And if I do, it'll be at your expense. So, and I think the other thing is also this sort of scarcity mentality out of which these sort of austerity schemes, et cetera, come. They're actually, they're wrong. There isn't scarcity. There's abundance in the world. There's abundance in nature. There's abundance in our lives, in our imagination. And we just sort of have to keep sort of killing that in order to fit the system that they've told us. What scarcity? I mean, how is it that the Global South still sort of, sends more money? How is it that the poor of the world subsidize the lifestyles of the rich? That's not scarcity. That means abundance. It's just that the abundance is being kept from the poor people, and that this is not a new problem, right? This is historical, it's 500 years of colonialism. Let's not sort of act like, and let's not act as if we can change it overnight, because there are very huge investments in keeping the system in place. With that said, it would be really great to hear thoughts, comments, including from you, Andrea and Jessica, if you want to add something further to what you said. We've got exactly 5 minutes, so please feel free to speak and share thoughts, anything you like. Go for it, Salma.
Thank you so much for the interventions. I just want to share a few words about administrative detention. Following an order of administrative detention, judicial review of the order must take place within 8 days, and the military judge retains that decision. And in most cases, they don't even read the evidence or the entire contents, and they just renew the decision. And the overwhelming majority of administrative detention orders are either approved or sometimes reduced in duration, and that this is part of Israel settler colonial apartheid regime, that it's used systematically as a means of arbitrary detention. And I'll leave it there for time.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or comments or questions? Jessica, any last words?
I think I was very excited when Andrea was also closing. In that I think the impact is very clear, it's very obvious, and it's very difficult, not difficult. I mean, we obviously understand why, or we know why a lot of states in the global south, and giving the example again of Malawi, why there's this false oblivion as to what exactly is going on. And for us as the Macroeconomic Alliance here in Malawi, one of our mandates is to ensure that people understand. So we break down the technical jargon that the IMF likes to throw around as though it's, this golden, what are those golden tablets that have been sent from the heavens only for them to understand with government. So we break that down because it's English. And one of the benefits of colonialism is they taught us English. So we understand what it is they're trying to say. And so we will break it down and explain it in our own languages that they try to erase. And we will use that to fight back. And so that's what we all need to do, is break it down so everybody can understand, hold our governments accountable, and push back until they get to a point where they understand that this is not our system, it's not working for us, and we don't want it anymore. And we did this already with colonialism, and we can do it again. I think I'll close with that. Thanks.
Couple seconds.
Yeah, I was just going to leave you with this sense of urgency. I think we are facing difficult times, just to say the least. And I mean, there's a sense of urgency around how we're spending the resources and how we are cross-cutting the struggles and link the struggles, so we are actually efficient with the resources that we have. Because here we can, here is warm, but outside it's very cold. So I would just leave it with that sense of urgency.
So we have literally, I think, a minute and a half. So I think on the question of sort of solidarity and acting collectively, maybe the last thing to say about that is also, you know, these spaces, like these are some of the spaces where people can, from all over the world and from different disciplines, can come together and meet. And yet we know there are challenges to getting here, right? The reason Jessica isn't here today is because she would have had to go to another country to apply for a visa, right? She'd have had to go to South Africa to get a visa to come here. So, you know, there are, let's think about sort of the hurdles, even in these spaces that are, you know, that are useful for bringing us together. And, you know, hybrid modalities is definitely one of those options. But also, you know, maybe we need to work our way towards a people's council, right? Spaces where more of us can come together, regardless of our economic ability and so on, from different struggles. So, Aluta continua to that. Thank you so very much for being here today. And I think we're ending on time. What do you know?
We did it.